Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Wise Decision Maker Show, where we help you make the wisest and most profitable decisions. Today, we want to talk about how do we not let cognitive biases, these dangerous judgment errors in our heads, not control us when we're dealing with COVID-19, the pandemic. It's very easy to make bad mistakes, and many people actually made pretty bad mistakes around the pandemic, even from the start of the pandemic and going onwards as well. But let's talk about the start of the pandemic. Elon Musk, one of the most famous entrepreneurs in the world, one of the richest people in the world, the founder of Tesla, SpaceX, and so on, he tweeted that the coronavirus panic is dumb on March 6, 2020, when COVID was taking root here in the United States. And that got a lot of likes, got a lot of retweets, 1.75 million likes, over 300,000 retweets, because he's very popular. And that, of course, caused many other people who listened to him to make bad decisions around the coronavirus pandemic. And then, just a short while later, in a couple of weeks after the declaration of the national emergency here in the United States on March 15th, on March 19th, so 4 days after that, he tweeted that based on current trends, probably close to zero new cases in the US by the end of April. Well, since that time, there have been around 8 million cases, and we're nowhere close to being done, and that's just a bad problem. He made a bad mistake, bad prediction. So many people who are entrepreneurs who trust Elon Musk, listen to him, and they made bad decisions in turn because of his advice. So that's new money. Maybe new money, more entrepreneurial, more likely to make mistakes. What about old money? People like Goldman Sachs, investment bank, very famous, very prominent. One of the key things that they do is give advice to their clients on how to invest. So they estimate US GDP growth, and they estimated US GDP growth in the second quarter of 2020. So second quarter of 2020, they made an estimate in February 24th. So it's the mid of the first quarter. The second quarter would start on April 1st, late first quarter. On February 24th, when the coronavirus pandemic was spreading widely in Italy and shutting down a number of cities, they said that it would be 2.7% growth of US GDP in the second quarter. Now, only a couple of weeks later, on March 15th, they changed their estimates from 2.7% growth to 5% decline. 5% decline, that's a huge change. That's a 7.7% change in 3 weeks. That's pretty bad. But only a few days later, on March 20th, they made another prediction that it would be a 24% decline. 24% decline. So it went from a 5% decline to a 24% decline. That's really bad. 19% change. Really, really bad. Obviously bad estimates. Obviously Goldman Sachs made some bad decisions around the pandemic. Lots of people made bad decisions, and most were caught unprepared and still continue to make some bad decisions around the pandemic, because they underestimated the threat and still continue to underestimate the threat of the pandemic, the consequences of the pandemic. So they were caught unprepared, and they had to turn to their business continuity plans, their emergency business continuity plans. So they chose to turn to them, even though these plans are not a good fit for the situation. I'm someone who's a future-proofing expert and risk management expert. I've done a lot of business continuity plans, and the typical business continuity plan is not a good fit for this sort of situation. Why is that? Because they're great for emergencies. Emergencies like 1 to 2 week emergencies, when there's a hurricane, when there's a blizzard, that's great. That's what they're fit for. But COVID-19 is not an emergency. That's not what it's about. It's a major disruptor, and that's how you should think of it. That's how it needs to be thought about. It's a major disruptor of our lives, of our worlds. It changed our path going forward. It's not a short-term emergency. It's a slow-moving, high-impact, long-term train wreck. It's a marathon, not a sprint. So relying on business continuity plans that are meant for a short-term emergency led a number of companies into serious problems, and led a number of people who relied on their emergency continuity plans, business continuity plans, into a number of serious problems. What we have to understand is that as a result of this major disruptor of COVID-19, this is a path changer. It is very much a path changer. The world will not go back to what it was. The world will change forever, even after the pandemic. We'll have years of the pandemic by the time it's over, of course. It's already been over a year, and it will be definitely much further before the pandemic is over. It will change, many, many months. And that's the pandemic here in the US. Globally, where there's not nearly as quick a vaccine rollout, it will still be longer. Will change people's habits. This pandemic will change people's values, their desires, their norms, their behaviors. We'll never go back to that world of January 2020, no matter how much we might want to. And that's something that we need to fundamentally understand about the pandemic and the kind of bad decisions, these cognitive biases that we make around it. And this is not easy to hear. When I first found out about the pandemic, when I was researching about it, trying to figure it out, it was very painful to me. I struggled with this information. It was really hard. And my clients, those with whom I work with on retainer, they found it really difficult to accept this negative information, this really unpleasant information about the pandemic. But what helped me and what helped them get over the hump is that it will be so much more painful for all of us in the long term if we don't accept and adapt to the pandemic and the major disruption for our path forward into the post-COVID reality, as well as still the many months of COVID remaining. So that's what we need to really be thinking about. The pandemic, again, is a slow-moving threat, and we, as human beings, we just make bad decisions around these slow-moving threats. Unusual threats, slow-moving ones, because of how our brain is wired. Our brain is not wired to deal with such slow-moving threats. Our brain is wired to have the fight or flight reflex. Our gut reaction is to greatly underestimate such threats. We face threats in the moment and we make decisions around them in the moment. We do not respond well to these slow-moving train wreck sort of threats because our gut reactions are based on the savanna environment. That's what they're about. The savanna environment, we had to face threats that were immediate. They were quick. We had to make that quick response. You might have heard of it as the fight or flight, as the saber-tooth tiger response. You want to jump it's better to jump at 100 shadows than to miss that one saber-tooth tiger. So that fight or flight reflex causes us to react quickly to immediate threats, which is great for saving our lives, but not react well to threats that are slow-moving train wrecks like the pandemic. And this leads to decisions that endanger our businesses, our careers, our households, all sorts of things. And here we need to understand why this bad advice is common. These bad advice comes as a result of these dangerous judgment errors, the savanna environment, the evolutionary background called cognitive biases. Cognitive biases are the specific ways that our brains goes wrong. Our brain goes wrong in specific ways, and these dangerous judgment errors describe the specific mental processes that cause us to make bad decisions. And they come again as a result of our evolutionary background and the structure, the wiring of the brain. The fight or flight response to threats was life-saving for those hunter-gatherers. That was great in that environment because the risks they faced were those immediate, intense, in-the-moment risks like saber-tooth tigers. But in the modern world, that's not the kind of risks we face. The risks we face are complex, ambiguous, long-term. They might come from a smartphone notification about a disease that came up somewhere in the middle of nowhere, China, right? Middle of China. So that is something that we have to realize. The kind of intuitive responses, gut reactions that we have to threats are not well adapted for the pandemic or most other modern world threats that are slow, high impact threats, low probability, slow moving, high impact threats. So these major disruptors. And there are specifically three dangerous judgment errors that we need to watch out for, these cognitive biases. By being aware of these cognitive biases and knowing about them and understanding them, we will prevent them from controlling us when we respond to COVID and other major disruptors. So three dangerous judgment errors, cognitive biases: the normalcy bias, the planning fallacy, and hyperbolic discount. Let's talk about each of them in turn. The normalcy bias, what does that refer to? Well, our intuition is to assume that everything will keep going normally. Everything will be fine. Everything will keep going as it has been going. In the Savannah environment, that was a pretty safe assumption. There wouldn't be really major changes. It would be just the change of the season, spring, summer, fall, winter, right? That's the major changes. Life would be pretty much the same throughout all this period. That is not a safe assumption in the modern world. Think about the 2008-2009 fiscal crisis. Not something that would have been applicable in the Savannah environment, and it fundamentally changed our lives, our economy going forward. The rise of the smartphone, that really changed things, that really changed dynamics for a number of businesses and for our everyday lives, and of course the COVID-19 pandemic. We cannot assume that the future will go as it has gone in the past. We are facing more and more disruptions in the modern world, and we can't fall into this normalcy bias. We can't forecast short-term future based on short-term past. By short-term, I mean the next few years. Our intuition is to feel like the next couple of years will be like the last, and that's not a safe assumption. It underestimates the likelihood and the impact of major disruptors. So by being aware of the normalcy bias, that will help you watch out for areas where you might be falling for it and help you address it. So that's one out of the 3 dangerous judgment errors. The second one is the planning fallacy. The planning fallacy. We tend to assume that the future will go according to plan. You might have heard the phrase, failing to plan is planning to fail. Failing to plan is planning to fail. It's a very famous phrase, it's well known, but it's very misleading. A much more effective phrase is failing to plan for problems is planning to fail. Failing to plan for problems is what I teach my clients. Failing to plan for problems is planning to fail. So you don't want to simply make a plan, think that everything will go according to plan. You want to specifically plan for problems to come up, because when we just make a plan, we intuitively don't put in nearly enough steps to address problems and risks that would come up. And then we underestimate the resources that we will actually need to accomplish our plans, to accomplish our projects, whether it's time, money, social capital, information of various sorts. We don't anticipate that well enough. And many people in the COVID pandemic have not changed their plans nearly quickly enough and have not adapted to the future of the post-world, of the post-COVID pandemic. They think that everything will go back to the world that it was in January 2020, like that, when the pandemic is over. First of all, the pandemic will be a slow rolling change as it goes from COVID to the post-COVID world, and we will never go back to January 2020. So you can't be thinking that way. That's the second one of the 3 dangerous judgment errors. The third one is hyperbolic discounting. Hyperbolic discounting. It's a fancy name for hyperbolic extra discounting of the future, because we perceive the short-term future as more important than the long-term future. That's our perception, that's our feeling. In the Savannah environment, that was a pretty safe assumption, just because you couldn't rely on the future. If you killed the mammoth, it was going to be pretty hard for you to save all the meat, so you better eat as much of it as possible, get it prepared, smoked, because you couldn't freeze it. And you couldn't carry stuff, you couldn't invest into land, right? That's not something you can invest. And you couldn't invest into your professional career. What, are you going to become a better axe chipper or something? That's not going to work out for you. Now, in the Savannah environment, you really needed to be short-term oriented. In the modern environment, of course, you can invest in your professional development, taking courses, getting coaching, getting various degrees, getting an MBA or something like that. Also, of course, you can invest in property, in your land, in your house, and so on, other fixed investments. And you could invest in your organization, your company, build that up better. And you could, of course, put money into the savings account. But that's not what it feels like. We don't intuitively recognize that that's something we should be doing. We undervalue the future, the long-term future, compared to our immediate short-term desires. So we prioritize the short-term to the detriment of the long-term, and we underestimate the long-term outcomes and impacts of various events like the COVID pandemic. So a lot of people greatly underestimated the long-term impact of the COVID pandemic, the duration of it, and they are really underestimating what the consequences of the pandemic will be even after it's over. And that's something that you can't fall into that trap. So again, by being aware of hyperbolic discounting, that will help you address it. So these are the 3 dangerous judgment errors that you should not let control you when you're dealing with COVID. The normalcy bias, thinking that the future will be much like the past. The planning fallacy, making a plan and thinking that everything will go according to plan, and hyperbolic discounting the long-term outcomes and impacts of events right now, discounting the long-term future at the expense of the desire to prioritize the short-term future. By being aware of these problems, you will not let them control you when you're dealing with COVID. So that's what I wanted to share about how to not let cognitive biases control you when you're dealing with COVID-19. And please make sure to like and follow of this Wise Decision Maker show. We have a video cast and a podcast, so wherever you got it, if it's a video cast on YouTube, if it's a podcast on iTunes or something like that, leave a review, leave a comment. We love to hear what you think. That really helps us make the show better, and it helps other folks decide whether they want to check out the show or not. And please share it with your friends on social media everywhere. And make sure to look in the show notes. There's a lot more information about these topics and other resources that you can check out. All right, everyone. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Wise Decision Maker Show. And I look forward to seeing you next time. Until then, the wisest and most profitable decisions to you, my friends.